Awesome. Well, welcome to EvolveDrupal. I am glad everybody's joining me this morning. Topic we're doing is Storybook to Drupal front-end components to live websites. I'm going to be tackling this in such an approach that I'm going to leave time at the end for some questions. I'm also going to have some slides up at the very end, though, so that you can feel free to reach out to me after the conference, during the conference, as well as a repo that you can actually take and use for yourself based off what I'm talking about. So who is this guy up here talking to you? So my name is Chaz Chumley. I'm the web application manager for the marketing technology team at UCLA Health. Manage the Drupal team. So what does that mean? It means that I manage the .edu side of the house, which is 170 plus sites now, as well as the .org side of the house. And we've had the pleasure of bringing the marketing and the technology sides together to join MarTech, and so far it has been a great experience. So what I'm going to briefly talk about is how we approached taking a look at different brandings that we had between the .edu, the .org side of the house, and the process that we went through to make sure that we were able to end up with a living style guide that Drupal could consume. So part of that was talking about these 5 points. One was, what were the project requirements? Secondly, the evaluation process, because if you've never taken a look at the Storybook itself, you may be, have familiarity with like Pattern Lab, Fractal, some of the other design systems out there. And so part of that was the evaluation process to see, was the Storybook where we wanted to be? Then I'll briefly talk about the implementation. How did we actually end up utilizing that? And then we were lucky enough to actually have Pattern Lab, but Pattern Lab has outgrown its need, and so we wanted to be able to take a look at what was the process involved in migrating those components over, and then finally, what was the Drupal integration look like? Because as we know, there's so many different ways to do the same thing. One way is generally the best way, and the other way is generally you run into issues in the end. So I want to hopefully get through those roadblocks with you. So with the project requirements, these are the things that we really needed to focus on. Number one was we knew we wanted to be Storybook based. We wanted to be able to have something that we could show our product owners, any other development teams that maybe were working on signage, on mobile apps, anything that needed them to be able to see branding and guidelines for that. We wanted something that was well maintained and supported. The Storybook fit that. The big one, and I have it highlighted, was we didn't want to have to do a lot of component refactoring. Like I said, we were already in Pattern Lab, and so we wanted the lowest barrier of entry, least minimal effort to be able to get over into Storybook. Big one, we also wanted something that was relatively easy to maintain. Storybook, in this case, was a no-brainer. It was very well supported in the community, great documentation. They update it so fast that we can't even keep it updated, type scenario, right? And then finally, Living Style Guide as our single source of truth. So during that evaluation process, we said, well, what is the community doing? Okay, because we saw Lullabot with a module that hooked into Storybook. We saw some other agencies like that were using Emulsify and Gesso, which is for Kitchens and Form 1. And then we said, well, okay, so we have this approach over here using Drupal, kind of pulling Storybook into it. We have this approach over here, which was Drupal talking to Storybook. But what was the barrier of entry for using these? And so after meeting with both Fort Kitchens and with Form 1 and with Lullabot, we came to the approach that we wanted more of a best practices approach. And so I'd say if you are just in your journey of thinking about utilizing Storybook, or if you're looking at migrating from Pattern Lab or another design system in Storybook, I think the key takeaway here is keeping the barrier of entry low as possible so that you don't have to be a JavaScript rocket scientist. You don't have to know how to create React. You're able to utilize the tools that you already have in your tool bag to be able to go from point A to point B. So once we figured that out, we said, all right, what's the implementation of this going to look like? How hard is this? Complex? What's the time involved in actually moving from Pattern Lab over into Storybook? Or even if you're in the middle of a rebrand or a refresh of a website, and you don't have a living style guide, what does the implementation process look like to get those design assets out of Figma, out of something that a tool that an agency might have handed over to you, and get that over into something that you can physically play around with, without actually having to worry about wiring it into Drupal first to actually get to be able to see what it looks like. And so with that implementation came a lot of tools. And again, keeping the point of the barrier of entry low as possible. We wanted to keep it simple. We wanted to minimize the tools that we actually needed, because when we were looking at different ones, we saw Webpack, Grunt, Gulp, all the different flavors of JavaScript frameworks that were out there, Sass, Less, PostCSS, Tailwind, all these different tool sets, and we're like, we don't want to have to relearn as a team all these different tools. We want to be able to, if we're going to have to learn something that's already highly adopted. Okay, and so with that, we wanted to lean on what was well maintained as well, and well documented. And the big one to me is, and I've always approached this even with Drupal as an architect, less is more. Don't need to add modules to utilize Storybook. I want to be able to have Twig understand Twig, and be able to work with the tools that we were already using. So during that implementation process, we looked at different tools, and so Vite, which is this icon up here, is mind-blowing if you've never played around with Vite. Vite actually is a JavaScript compiler that will actually compile down your CSS and your JavaScript. It does something called hot module replacement, meaning if I'm overwriting some CSS or some Twig and I hit save, I can't go over to the browser fast enough to see the change that actually got implemented. It's instantaneous, so it actually will change the piece of the component or the piece of markup or the CSS in place without having to refresh the browser. So this was mind-blowing. Obviously, Storybook, did it integrate well with Storybook? Storybook actually uses Vite, as well as we looked at what is Drupal using from a core standpoint of compiling CSS. And so that's where we leaned on PostCSS. And then because we're in a JavaScript environment, there was the age-old question of Twig PHP versus Twig JS. Is Twig JS mature enough to be able to do all the things that Twig PHP was doing? The answer is yes. And so all of these tools that you see on the board is what we ended up with. But in reality, between the Vite and the Storybook, it's almost a set it and forget it once you've set it up. And time permitted, I'll show you a little bit of that. So then it came to, okay, great, we know the tools that we want to use. The barrier of entry was low. We were keeping it simple. So the next thing was, how do we go about migrating these components? And so on the left-hand side there was our pattern lab instance. So I'm going to use a card as an example because everybody has a card on their websites nowadays, right? So how do we go about moving from pattern lab to Storybook? And then what is this new thing that we have to create called a story? You're like, never seen that before. So Storybook has this thing called stories, which allows you to then expose your Twig, your CSS, your JavaScript, your Markdown, and a UI so that you can actually view it, so you can play around with it. You can see if it's responsive, accessible. There's all kinds of tools in the Storybook ecosystem that you can extend upon. And so on the left-hand side with Pattern Lab, we already had our CSS, we had our JavaScript, we had a Markdown file, Twig, we had a YAML file. And so we're all, and even if you are not familiar with the design system using Pattern Lab, these are all tools. Add an HTML dot in there. You're doing Drupal theming. You're doing Drupal theming. Now single director components. You're also doing Drupal theming. So nothing new there. So in order for us to pull this over into Storybook, all we had to literally do was add a single file, and the single file was that story. And when you first take a look at stories, they're actually pretty dang simple to actually implement. In this example, I'm displaying a card that we have at UCLA Health. And the way it gets pulled in is literally, this is a story. So if you've written any JavaScript before, it should look very familiar to you. Where you're saying, hey, I want to import a card. You could have called that card Chaz, Joe, whatever you want to name it. Right? Naming stuff is always hard. But since it was a card we were representing, we said, we're going to import this card. We're going to have that come from the card.twig that we have wrote. The data for it, so the actual static values, because we're not in Drupal. Drupal doesn't know Storybook exists. Storybook doesn't know Drupal exists in this setup here. We wanted to be able to have the data that's getting pulled into this card come from our YAML file, okay? Stuff that we already had existing. So then it just came about to, we need to create a setting to give it a title so that it would show up under our components under this card folder for us, right? Next, we wanted to actually export out this card so it would actually display. And so all we had to say was, hey, the name of this is event card. It's going to render our arguments, and our arguments are coming from data, and they're being passed to card. So once you've set a story up, 90% of the components you're going to be creating look identical to what you have here. You're just swapping out the twig with the twig, the YAML with the YAML. And so it made it super simple for us to start taking our Pattern Lab instances, or if you're creating a new story, and started developing these. And then we had a UI which was much more robust than Pattern Lab or some of the other design systems, for us to be able to turn around and give this back to our product owners and say, hey, is this what you were expecting? Remember, I'm not in Drupal yet. And this is the power of this, because you shouldn't really need to be in Drupal in order to show your end users what something's going to look like. They can actually play around with it. There's different tools in place here for them to be able to see if something's responsive or accessible. So then it came to, great, now we have this. How do we tell Drupal what's over in Storybook? Or in the case of, and we've seen this historically, how many people have been doing Drupal for more than 5 years? Okay. I don't know if you remember back in the Pattern Lab days, when, we're kind of repeating ourselves now with Storybook, right? It was, oh, we want to pull Pattern Lab into Drupal. So when Storybook came along, we want to pull Storybook into Drupal. No. The power of Storybook is that separation. How many people here either have or do WordPress? I can take the same Storybook instance, pop this out, drop this into a WordPress project, turn on the Timber plugin, which allows me to do twig templating, and now I have a living style guide and UI that I can use in something else that's not Drupal specific. So if you're going to learn anything from today, keep those two things separate. Storybook, even though it's sitting inside of a Drupal theme folder structure, doesn't know Drupal exists. Drupal doesn't know Storybook exists. And that's by design until you get to the Drupal integration. So the Drupal integration, we have structured content, okay? So no longer we have static values, we have arrays, objects, whatever Drupal's going to throw to us when it renders out a page, a paragraph type, a block type, any type of entity. We have twig to twig, even though Drupal uses .html.twig, right? So the point of this is, don't overthink this. Use what you already know to be able to do this, okay? And so while this fancy graph here kind of talks about the different layers between it, this is really all it comes down to. Okay, so in this case, I'm looking at an alert component, right? So alert component, this is what I have sitting over in Storybook. This is what I have sitting over in Drupal for the template that it's rendering, okay? And I'm using basic twig theming practices, right? Includes, embeds, extends. And here I'm saying, hey, include. This is sitting in a folder called Elements. This is that components module, if you're not familiar with it, that allows the twig namespacing to take place so that Drupal can talk to something that's .twig. They say, hey, point to the Elements folder, look inside there for alert folder, look for a twig file called alert twig, and with it, pass Drupal's attributes to it. Don't want to break Drupal, right? And pass to the text field, my WYSIWYG field, and I'm using some other stuff, field value to drive a string, but anyways. Simple thing here is I'm actually including this. So what is happening is going over and going, oh, I see over in this elements folder an alert.twig, and in it is what I have represented over here on the right hand side. So this is using some other best practices, which is not part of this conversation, but using BEM, naming conventions, SMACs, all the stuff that if you go to Drupal.org and look at theming, you're going to find. And so when this gets pulled in, this literally gets replaced in here. The attributes get passed in, and the text gets passed in, and then it renders that alert. That was a lot to drink through a fire hose in a short amount of time, so we got a couple of minutes for questions. And before I get to the questions, please, you're always welcome to reach out to me. I am happy to sit down with you, your organization, your agency, and have this discussion. I've done this many times. And the repo here too, I would say take a look at this. This is an open repo. This will give you a bare bones implementation of what we're actually already using at UCLA Health. and it's a great starting point for you to be able to play around, adopt. For instance, Smithsonian is using this. University of Waterloo is also utilizing the stuff that we've done. So questions? Yes?
How can we learn more about the Storybook? Where can we, is this where we can go to learn more about it?
So Storybook itself just goes to the website for Storybook, and which I can flip over, but I can't. So if you just Google Storybook, you're going to find tons of documentation on Storybook itself. Like anything, I don't want you to be overwhelmed with what you're looking at, because you could create a React component in Storybook. You can create an HTML Webpack if you want to use Webpack. There's HTML Vite if you want to use Vite. And so ours uses Vite. Ours is following a minimalist approach to it, and then you can just expand upon it. Yes?
Oh, I'm sorry. So just questioning, during all those implementation projects, any challenges you find before and after? Is that technically related or human related? Or after the project being set up? Like, do you ever have any challenge? Also, how long this project can take?
So, I mean, you can start by, right now this is actually, you can drop this into, and it's already set up as a Drupal theme, so you can drop this in your Drupal project, enable this, and you'd have this working for you. It might look like a mobile website, which is white with black text and nothing formatted in there, unless you actually create the Drupal paragraph type or block type, whatever it is you're working with in the ecosystem, to point to what we saw back here, right, as an example. But there weren't, to me, there's no really technical challenges or human challenges as long as you understand HTML, CSS. If you can write HTML and CSS, you can use Storybook. It's that simple. How many people here use CodePen?
CodePen?
CodePen, familiar with CodePen? Yeah. So the same concept, right? Back on that Storybook component, you can take that CodePen component, drop it into the .twig, and have it be static HTML and CSS. Then when you start layering upon that with the YAML to add the static values for it, and then you do the Drupal integration, which allows for Drupal then to talk to it. So to me, there's no technical or human challenges with it. It's just how much you want to use when you're building your project out, because you can start small and then build from that.
Are you using single directory components, or have you thought about using Drupal single directory components with Storybook?
So we chose not to use single directory components. I've had this discussion with Mike Herschel many times. It's really one of those decision points of like where you want to go with this, because we don't want to be locked in to Drupal or Drupalisms, right? We decided to keep those very agnostic, and so our approach is so that if I need to then pick this, even though we're not using WordPress at UCLA Health, campus side does build WordPress sites, and so they have the ability to use this if they want to. So that's the approach that we took. Very agnostic, very unopinionated is the approach that we've always taken. So.
That was actually my question. Like, have you used this with anything other than Drupal? Your team,
Yes.
Our team, when we were working on something very similar, we've got it now running in both Drupal and WordPress.
Yep.
Just wondering if maybe we might want to connect at some point,
Yeah.
just to kind of share
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah, absolutely happy to do that. Yeah, so the question was, are you using this outside of Drupal? Yes, I've used it outside Drupal and WordPress with term replacement, but anything that understands .twig, so Grav, Craft, Symfony project by itself, WordPress, Drupal, could utilize what you have here. The only Drupalisms in here would be, there's a .info file, there's a .libraries file, there's a .theme file, because we want to build upon that for Drupal purposes, since we're obviously at a Drupal summit. But you could easily take and delete those Drupal files out, which is 3 or 4 files, and plug in your WordPress ecosystem.
Yeah, I think like we have our own platforms that we run, but then I think above and beyond, it would be lovely to offer to the institution the ability to use this in other contexts.
Yeah.
And so we haven't like offered it as a service, but like we're thinking about it in years to come.
And that was my thinking when I first got to UCLA Health. I know where we ran out of time was, anybody here remember Pinky and the Brain? Right? So I was like, the one design system to rule the UC. That was the approach when I first came in. I'm like, why are we all working individually, and why are we working hard? Let's work smarter. Let's create a baseline design system that can plop in and use across the whole UC system in California. So that was also kind of in the back of my approach when I was doing it, keeping it agnostic. So.
And take over the world.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Take over the world when
Same thing we do every day.
Yeah. So, all right, well, we're out of time, but I'm happy to grab me outside or email me. So thank you for coming today. I appreciate it.